All right, Logan, thank you. Welcome to Bitcoin to the People. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
I'm really excited to be here, Carrie. Thank you.
Cool. So let's start with a little bit about you to kind of make sense of why we're here today and why we're having this conversation.
Sure. So I'm a lawyer, although if you would have told me when I was coming up in high school, college, that I would be a lawyer, I would have told you were nuts. I wanted to be for the longest time, I wanted to be a professor of English literature or a writer. And so I went to grad school for that in Chicago. Decided I didn't want to get a PhD after all. Became a high school teacher, did that for a few years in Chicago. Eventually decided maybe I should go to law school, which is an interesting decision, but met my now wife in law school. So it was great for that purpose. And then when I got out of law school, I started practicing at a big corporate law firm in Chicago, doing a lot of very corporate things, big mergers and acquisitions, securities offerings for public companies, did work on investment funds, just kind of in that world of money. And did that for a couple of years. Decided I didn't really like doing that as much. My wife got a job back sort of on the East Coast where we're from, moved back, now I do litigation stuff, represent injured workers mostly. And I write about Bitcoin, and I'm just continuing to get deeper and deeper into this, kind of wondrous and wacky and transformative world of Bitcoin.
Yeah, you're a man who's lived like many lives. You've had
kind of, yeah. For a while, it was a joke with my wife where I was telling her I've lived in a different apartment basically every year for 12 years or something crazy like that. So we're pretty settled now, which is nice. But yeah, it's been a journey to get here for sure.
Yeah, very cool background, especially the just from like your writing and what I know of you. It's like interesting to think of you as like a corporate attorney, at one point. But it makes sense too that you have so much knowledge of like finance versus economics. So I think you and I started chatting because it seems like there's like a conflating of the two, and these are not the same things. So it's interesting. So how did you get into Bitcoin, and when was that?
I have a fun Bitcoin intro story. I think like a lot of people, I don't know if it was this way with you, Carrie, but I think a lot of people, it requires multiple touch points, multiple encounters to kind of.
I think the average is seven touch points is like the average. So you have to talk to someone before they like buy $10 on Coinbase. I'm like, what?
Right. Yeah. So that was kind of me. So my first encounter was in 2017. I think it was the summer of 2017. I was on a plane or a train. I don't know which, but I was in transit. I do remember that. And I flipped open my phone and I was listening to an episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast with Nick Szabo. I had no clue at the time who Nick Szabo was. And obviously now, we all know cypherpunk, kind of an OG in the space. But the episode was titled something like, King of Cryptocurrency or Master of Crypto. It was something with something cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, like, what the hell is cryptocurrency? I mean, I just had no clue. And so I got on the train or the plane, whichever one. I listened to this episode. It was like a 2-hour episode. It's a pretty long episode, very heady, very deep and complicated. A lot of stuff I didn't understand, but I was very intrigued, and I started kind of poking around a little bit for more resources, not with any kind of urgency at the time, but eventually I did what I was used to doing at the time. I mean, I was kind of, I guess, a quasi academic. So my first instinct was, let me find a book, let me find some book. Surely somebody's written a book about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And but it was 2017. So at that time, Saifedean's book wasn't out. I think so I ended up getting this book called Digital Gold by a guy named Nathaniel Popper. And it was all right. I read most of it. I don't think I finished it, but I ended up, it was interesting, but it just didn't hit me as much. I did get some Bitcoin in 2017, rode the wave 2017, which was wild. I remember going home with Thanksgiving, and I think I brought it up at the table, like everybody did in 2017.
Yeah.
Um, and some of my friends in law school at the time, got some too, and were dabbling in the altcoins and stuff like that. But it didn't stick with me. I didn't find the right voices at the time. I didn't find the right influences, the right information. And so I sold pretty near the top. So not at the top, but close enough that I made money, and I felt like a genius at the time, because it crashed all the way down. And I was thinking, oh, wow, see, I got out.
I knew it was over.
Right. I totally knew it. I was just trading this thing up like a genius. Yeah. And so, and then I was kind of the next, in 2018, I took a class actually in law school on securities regulation. And so we talked about blockchain and cryptocurrency a fair amount, because people were trying to figure out at the time, what's a security when it comes to crypto. And so we talked about that in class, but still, that was kind of the second encounter, and it still didn't really get me. So some time passes, I'm doing my job, and then COVID hits, and the stock market just dies basically. Several days in a row, it's just bloody. It's just awful. And then all of a sudden, a really weird thing started to happen. We were, everybody was getting COVID, it seemed like, and the country was shut down and supply chains were destroyed, but the stock market was just going up.
I'm like, it just like died and came back to life really quickly. And I'm like, and it hasn't died again. And, it's due. The bill is coming due.
Right. And I was kind of, exactly. I was looking at it thinking to myself, this, I'm not dumb. At least I don't think so. And this just doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't feel like this makes any sense to me. So I started kind of digging around, and I kind of started doing a deep dive into things that I had up until that point not spent any time ever in my life thinking about, things like monetary policy. And that was when Bitcoin kind of popped back onto my radar. It was sort of summer of 2020. Then it popped up for the third or fourth time. And this time it really stuck. And I think so much of getting Bitcoin to stick, I think, is about the quality of the information that you receive, the resources that you're exposed to or that you encounter initially. And for me, I look back and I think, wow, if I would have sort of in 2017, 2018, if instead of reading that one book that I got, if I had instead known to maybe go on Twitter, or if I found like, Nick Carter or Preston Pitch or somebody like that. But instead my instinct was, I got to go find the book, because I'm a book guy. I mean, to this day, I'm a book guy. But there just weren't that many books available. So that's kind of what I view my role a little bit with the newsletter, and you guys are doing a great job of it too, is just directing people to good resources, because there's a lot of bad resources out there, and it's probably more bad resources now maybe than ever. So because it's really important in the journey that you find somebody who can sort of explain to you the implications of this thing in a way that's easy to understand and that resonates.
It's funny that you mentioned in 2017, what was your foray? Because it made me think back, and I like kick myself, because in 2017 we were in Puerto Rico, and there was like, I don't know if you've heard of Brock Pierce.
I don't think I had. It sounds vaguely familiar.
He's like I think he's like running for senator in Vermont. But he's been in Puerto Rico forever. Yeah. And we see this guy, and he's a bit strange. He's short. He's very eclectic, right? Like he wears like a Panama hat with like, ornaments hanging from it. When you see him, you're like, okay, something's going on there. And he had video cameras rolling and whatever. And I was like, what's going on here? So, because I was like, this guy obviously is not Puerto Rican. I am. So I'm like, looking, I'm like, all right, this guy doesn't like, he's not from here. What's the deal? So we listened a little bit what he was talking about. So we go back, of course, being creepy voyeurs, and we Google him. And all we could find was like mainstream media articles like slamming him. How he's like doing all this terrible stuff in Puerto Rico, which I'm sure there's a lot of truth to, right? Like, I'm sure that it's whatever, not well received for a bunch of people with a ton of money to be like moving there and just sort of taking over the place. But I was like, oh, Bitcoin's like I thought it was like so stupid at the time after I read the article. But I'm like, yeah, I had like worms in my brain. Like, I just was like, oh, this is so dumb. Of course.
Yeah,
that was, but I'm like, yeah, the bad
point.
information. And then as I started, then probably in 2021, started following him. I'm like, hey, I remember this guy. And I'm reading and I'm like, yeah, there's definitely stuff that's really out there about him. But there, it's undeniable. Like he's had the vision towards Bitcoin since like 2010. And there's really something to that. I think that's what got me really challenging my own thinking, that I'm like, man, I don't know what kind of willpower and like critical thinking it took to stay with it since 2010 for, him and a lot of other people. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's, when you said about sort of like challenging your own assumptions and being self-reflective, I think one of the challenges, and maybe you agree with this, of kind of quote unquote getting Bitcoin, like having it actually stick and sort of resonate with you, is for most people, not all people, but I think for most people, Bitcoin, and it doesn't really even matter what end of the political spectrum you're on or sort of where you fall on that spectrum, Bitcoin is probably going to challenge one of your fundamental beliefs on how society is or should be organized, how money works, or how you think the economy works, all sorts of things like that. I think Bitcoin has this uncanny way of it just kind of confronts all of that. And it's going to challenge some of those underlying beliefs that you have. And so I think for a lot of people, and me very much included, I wasn't at a place when I first encountered it where I felt like the narrative of Bitcoin was strong enough to make me turn inward and really be reflective and scrutinize some of my beliefs and or some of my understandings of how things worked. And I think that's a challenging thing to do. It's hard. It's difficult to sort of look at something that you believe for a while and sort of realize, oh, maybe that's not actually how this works.
Yeah, it's so true. That was one of my moments that I'm like, this kind of thinking keeps people broke. Like this kind of thinking, like if you are just like grouping everything in as like not for you, because my first time that I heard about Bitcoin was in 2015, and it was like by a very old school investment banking guy on Wall Street. His name was Ron. I met him at like a startup happy hour, and he was talking about the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. And I was like, I don't even know what any of this is. Bitcoin was like $300, and he was like, look, just know if this thing goes up in 5 years, like, I don't even know what he said. Like basically, you and I will be super rich, but that was kind of it. And I'm like, I was like, well, he'll probably be super rich, because I saw myself as someone who would never be super rich in 2015. I was like, I mean, that's probably like good for him. And my mom, when I told her about it, she was like, I told you, I heard about it from this news. She was on some weird like developer newsletter. I have no idea why. She's a nurse. She's not a developer, but she's big on privacy because her identity was stolen. So she was on some weird like dark web newsletter. Well, not a dark web newsletter really, but something to that effect. And she's like, but I want to understand it. And I was like, yeah, it's not for us. That was just how I had it in my head. I'm like, just, move on. It's probably, some kind of grift. So yeah, when I realized, I'm like, man, when we talk about stuff that really, holds you back, I'm like, no, really, like getting tunnel vision can really harm you long term.
100%.
So interesting foray, your thread that you wrote about, this like from Bernie to Bitcoin, and sort of your journey. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what for you that kind of had that come about?
So I think, Bitcoin, like we just said, I mean, this is a perfect segue because Bitcoin just makes you challenge so many of the beliefs that you hold. So for me, for the longest time, I basically looked at the way that the government solves problems is the government throws money at the problems, essentially. That, I had no idea how that money, how we got the money, what we did. I assumed it all came from taxes, but in the 2020 elections, I was kind of looking around like a lot of people, I think, and just saying, okay, things look like they're fraying in meaningful ways here, alarming ways. It looks like we're kind of being ripped apart a little bit. Obviously the gap between the top 1% and the bottom 99% was yawning ever wider. And it seemed to me that, and so like a lot of people, I think that this is just unsustainable. And so like a lot of people, I was attracted to the narrative, the Bernie Sanders narrative of, we need to sort of rein in people who are evading taxes. We need to levy more taxes on wealthier people to try to pay for this. And we're just going to sort of provide laundry list of services and different things. And we're just going to sort of kind of raise everybody's boat, so to speak, by kind of just pouring money at everything. Yeah. And that did sound pretty good. I was at the time I was thinking, wow, yeah, we certainly do need to solve these problems. Obviously, if these problems persist, this is the type of thing that historically ends with people's heads on spikes and large scale revolts. And I think there's an interesting. We'll probably touch on this a little bit later too. I think there's some interesting through lines between, and people will kill me for saying this, but there are some interesting through lines between Marxism and sort of Bitcoin maximalism, in the sense that they both identify the same problem, and they both just solve it in different ways. So I think for me, that's why I don't think it's a huge, some people came at me on Twitter and they're like, oh my God, you lost me at Bernie, because I can't imagine a Bitcoiner ever being a Bernie Sanders supporter. But then I had some other people say, hey, I completely understand your journey. It's a pretty common journey, actually, because it's not, what you're doing is we're looking at the same problem. But if you were sort of a Bernie person, you're saying, oh, the way we solve this, let's just print as much money as is necessary to sort of give out to everybody and for everything, and sort of will centralize, kind of governmental direction over everything. And whereas a Bitcoiner is looking at it and saying, okay, I see the same problem, but what you want to do is actually kind of counterproductively exacerbating the problem in some ways, or you're sort of kicking the real solution down the road into the future. And the way that we actually solve this is by, let's just fix the fundamental sort of base layer of society, the money. Let's stop inflating that. Let's stop, flooding all this liquidity in, which really just pools in assets and ends up benefiting the precise group of people that you're hoping to kind of disempower a little bit. And so I mean, I was kind of, it wasn't a huge jump for me in terms of how far it was to get from Bernie to Bitcoin, but the principles and ideas that I had to kind of confront and learn about and examine, that was certainly, that was challenging. And there were times, I'm sure you felt this way, times in that kind of intellectual journey where you're kind of wondering, am I even the same person? What is,
oh my God, yes.
Yeah, it's like being in the midst of the Matrix. It's literally, I think the reason Bitcoiners love the Matrix movie so much, I mean, one of the reasons is that it is that kind of getting Bitcoin and sort of really understanding it. It really is like, taking that pill and seeing reality sort of for the first time, or in a wholly different light. And that can be really unsettling at first and make you kind of question. It really sort of like fragments your identity a little bit initially.
No, it's a reality. It's reality shattering. Once you really get curious about it, and it's interesting that you mentioned, the Marxism, capitalism. I'm not an expert on either, but I was watching in like 2020, just kind of like, there was like this longing for like a sane voice. And for me, I was like, I don't know all these new people who are like on the mainstream media and feel very grifty. So my go-to was always like Cornel West, in my, like when I was younger. So I was looking up a video of him, and I'll share the video with you. It was a video of him and a fellow professor who was a very good friend of him, who is a deeply Catholic Republican. And, I mean, I think you're familiar with Cornel West. He's like not that.
Hey, actually, Cornel spoke at my undergrad, college. I remember going
Okay.
to see him speak. Yeah.
So it's funny, I'm watching it and I'm like, oh, this is just such a reminder of like how things can be and actually are off of the internet. And, you know, it was a great video. I think they were talking mainly about healthcare and just like, you know, yes, there should be some sort of public option and, you know, they both have different stances, but there should be some kind of option for everybody to be able to afford it. Who provides it is where the rub is.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I watched that video, maybe like 8 or 9 months later, I found myself really much more in agreement with Robert McCormick. Because I'm like, yeah, he's not saying like everything should come from the private sector. And, you know, I don't think that's even what Cornel West believes. It's just that like the time to like tease out these conversations and then have the vantage point of like, oh, again, this goes back to the money system and like, you know, the rot that lives inside of, the pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and for-profit medicine and just this whole like really complex system. And then hearing that same exact conversation and being like, oh, wow, this, I'm just looking at this differently. So that was an indicator for me. And then wanting to get different media sources that I listen to. I had already like made some purchase of Bitcoin, but was not on Twitter, nothing like that. But I just was like, I can't like watch the mainstream news, but like I need to somewhat be in the know. And I started seeing who like independent media was interacting with, and there was a lot of Bitcoiners, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. There's more to this. And then, you know, it helps you to really understand like altcoins and all of these other things and, you know, what they serve and how Bitcoin is just totally different. So yes, it's reality shattering and challenges just so much of what you think is true.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And, you know, one of the other things I was touching on in the thread is, you know, it really struck me to, once you start learning about Bitcoin, you start learning about, you know, money, and you start learning about the history of money, and you start thinking about monetary policy, you realize too how, and it might be just way too high of an expectation of, I mean, perhaps, but perhaps not, of Congress to actually understand all of that when they're making decisions. I mean, I think we entrust lawmakers to make decisions on such a wide sphere of human action and human behavior. And that it's, do we expect them to be experts? Do we expect them to possess a level of expertise on every single issue on which they legislate? Is that unreasonable to expect that?
Yeah.
Is there I remember reading an article in the Atlantic, you know, several years ago about just, you know, the powers of the executive and of government generally have just expanded broadly and vastly over the last 50, 100 years. So, I mean, do we really expect every member of Congress, when they're making a decision on, oh, what should we spend money on, or how should we you know, tax people or do these monetary things and fiscal things, do we expect them to understand the downstream effects? Do we expect them to have, you know, kind of read up on monetary theory, monetary history, or do we assume, or do we think that they're just kind of operating under some pretty basic, you know, kind of quote unquote common knowledge, common understanding stuff that's basically just Keynesian stuff regurgitated?
Yeah.
This kind of, oh yeah, you know, inflation is always good, and you know, that type of thing. And so that's kind of another thing I was questioning in the thread is, you know, I think what Bitcoin does is it does reduce a little bit of the kind of surface area on which errors and missteps can happen if you can kind of have a monetary policy that's not subject to the whims and vicissitudes of you know, these people who may or may not you know, have an intelligent view on how we should be you know, supplying the money.
Yeah, it's and I think that that it's true, because if you have a surface level knowledge of Bitcoin, you're more likely than not to sort of walk away from it like, oh, whatever, you know, too much work, too much this, too much that, and write it off. But you know, once you've done that requisite, I don't know, 100 hours, 1,000 hours, 10,000 hours, who even knows at this point? I haven't met anyone who's done that work and is like, holy shit, this is something to, in a league of its own. And there's no requirements to become a congressperson. So, a lot of people, they love the Cinderella story of like an AOC going from like bartender to congresswoman. And I'm like, there's merit to that. And then there's also like, we also need subject matter experts. So where I think working as a wage worker, she has a personal experience doing that. But if we're looking to someone who doesn't, and I don't mean her in particular about Bitcoin, if you don't have that 10,000 hour, whatever it is requisite, we can't expect that they're going to bring that fully, because what you do see, well, I could use New York as an example, like Eric Adams, obviously he doesn't understand Bitcoin. Like last summer, he hoodwinked everyone and it was like, yeah, I'm gonna get half of my paycheck in Bitcoin. He's like, no to Bitcoin mining like 2 months ago. And I'm like, but this is like clown show that you can expect, and people are like, well, we've got to, like people want to, I know, I kind of guess the temperature of like the next presidential candidate. I'm like, unless it's somebody from like this top 100 people in Bitcoin Twitter, not that I'm saying they should run for president, but I'm talking about for their like knowledge level. I'm like, they don't know, like they just don't. If they're just because they say the word Bitcoin doesn't mean that we should be like.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's certainly a shit show out there. There's some cool groups doing some educational outreach and stuff to members of Congress, and I'm hoping that it's going well. I fear that it's not, but we will see.
Yeah, and I think it also just is at the Bitcoin conference, Jordan Peterson, I think he got booed a little bit maybe when he was like, I think that there's a lot of things that Bitcoiners have been right about and will continue to be right about, but there's just not enough conversation around like, well, what are the adverse effects of what could happen? And yeah, there, I've heard like answers, but like really, so who knows? I don't know. If I know the answer, then there is no answer. I'll put it that way. And I'm like, yeah, if I'm the person coming up with the answers, then yeah, definitely we've got to do some searching. So what was your sort of aha moment with Bitcoin and your own like personal investing ethos when you were like, oh my God, like I can't unsee what I saw in the Matrix?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it definitely goes back to probably April 2020-ish. I would say. I started to do sort of a lot of research on my own on Bitcoin. I wasn't really talking to my wife about it at that point. It was kind of this sort of secret hobby of mine.
All right, that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, so I was starting to get into it, and I'm not sure what I would say is kind of like the aha moment. I was starting to really question, honestly. I've always had an affinity for, kind of the FIRE movement style of investing, personal finance stuff, and, live well below your means, throw your money in broad market index funds and just kind of relax, because, as they say, the market always goes up and nothing will ever go wrong, because if you live long enough, you'll be a billionaire and that sort of thing. And not to knock that. I think there's a lot of nuance. It doesn't get discussed there, but I don't, maybe it was for some reason, I'm thinking it was a Preston Pish podcast, maybe that I listened to. I mean, I think Preston does such an amazing job of articulating. I think he's almost like he's like a sort of spirit guide for a lot of people's aha moments, I think. Because he articulates the grand, larger macroeconomic picture so well, and in a way that's, you don't have to have a finance background or a PhD to understand.
Shit. Damn it. All right, I lost you for like a minute, but I think.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, you froze on my end a little bit, but I think we're back now.
Okay, cool. I'm just like, I don't know where the video went, but I think we're good. I think it just picks up where it left off. I mean, clearly Zoom better be able to pick up where they left off with a hiccup in the
One
internet.
would hope, yeah.
So where we left off was you were saying Preston Pysh is sort of like a spirit guide.
Oh yeah. So I think, I was probably listening to some of his podcasts, and I think he just articulated the macroeconomic picture so well and so convincingly to me that I just thought to myself, I got to get in this. At the time, my wife was working. My wife is a venture capital attorney, and so she also is constantly seeing, what people are investing in, what the next wave of technology is, and which is actually probably good for the conversations that we did eventually have about Bitcoin. But so I remember thinking, man, I gotta get in this. And but she was working in-house at the time and for a regulated institution, so I had to clear it. I had to make sure that I was allowed to make this purchase, or if it was going to get her in trouble or her job. So I remember that was kind of the point where I had to ask her and say, hey, like, so cryptocurrency, there's no easy way to kind of start that conversation out of nowhere. You just kind of say, hey, let's talk about Bitcoin. And she's kind of like, what? But so eventually got the okay, made the biggest purchase of Bitcoin that I've made to date. Was my first purchase getting back in. And I just continued to build conviction from there. I had some skin in the game now, and then I just dove just fully in, just head first, and really haven't looked back since. I mean, it's occupied so much of my time, but I always tell people, I've been in school a lot. I've done a lot of schooling. I love school. I love learning. I love reading. I mean, that's my favorite thing to do. And to this day, the most intellectually thrilling and exhilarating experience I've ever had is going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I've never been more humbled, challenged, and just kind of just lit up in my brain as I have been on this Bitcoin journey. So I recommend it to everybody.
No, it's true. It really is. It's so cool. It's kind of gave me like some renewed vitality around learning something new, because I think I was in like I'm not like someone, I wasn't like totally destitute, and then Bitcoin came as like the savior. It's not that story for me, but I was having a lack of like interest around things, and like that, like just sort of nihilism that in the past few years has like crept in. And then I'm like, oh my God, you feel like you really have something to keep going at in terms of like learning more and more and more. And you at a certain point know that rabbit hole goes really deep. And it's interesting what you said about Preston, because that was probably a second or third aha moment for me. Because like I said, in the beginning, it was just like, man, this was number go up for me. Like, I was like, this is cool. Look at this. Like, let's go. And then I saw his chart where he prices the S&P 500 in Bitcoin versus USD. Yeah. And I was like, I was like, wait a minute. And it's funny because like my favorite person on Twitter is definitely like Max Kaiser. But I realized that like I really love him for his just audaciousness and cult of personality. And I'm like, now I understand what he means when he's like, all fiats are going to zero. Like, it just sounded catchy and funny to me. And I was like, ha ha ha. Like, I don't know what that means, but okay, fine. And then, it really like I contextualized it. And it's funny when you look like on Google, if you do like Bitcoin price, it'll show you in comparison to USD. But if you reverse it and do like USD to Bitcoin, it just shows like, it's just been going down since 2013. And that was like extremely eye-opening for me. And I started digging into like more different places in history. And you figure out that like every major uprising pretty much has been connected to currency debasement.
Yeah, those are really powerful graphs. And for me, I think the graph that really shook me was the and I forget where the first place I saw it was. It could have very well been Preston, but the graph of the S&P layered onto the graph of the money supply increase. And when they're essentially the same line. And, I think in the personal finance space, I mean, you have a lot of people who are kind of out here, sort of proclaiming, how much their portfolios are going up because they're looking at a number on the computer screen, but they're not actually thinking about purchasing power. And that's, at the end of the day, wealth is purchasing power. It's not the number on your computer screen. And so when you kind of change the denominator and look at the graphs in that way, it's pretty terrifying. Because when those things are the same line, what happens is you have a bunch of people who think they're getting wealthy, but really are not. They might be getting, marginally wealthier, but they're in no way sort of clearing the 10% every year on average that they think that they're clearing. Yeah. And I just don't think that's something that is commonly understood. And for a while on Instagram, I was kind of ranting and raving about this for a while. And, there are a few bigger accounts now that are kind of just now starting to wake up a little bit to this idea of, the money supply. But it is, you're kind of a lone voice, yelling into the void. If you're kind of in personal finance, that space, talking about, the money supply and stuff like that. But yeah, that was a jarring graph for me as well. And there's a great website called, I think it's Ecoinometrics. It's a Substack, and you may have seen it. They do all these graphs pricing things in Bitcoin.
Okay.
And they'll show like a Big Mac and the S&P and cars and just everything. It's just, the graph is just straight down. Everything is getting cheaper in Bitcoin terms. And so, you can just scroll through a bunch of those graphs and you're just kind of like, whoa, it's the world upside down, basically.
No, for sure. And I think it's also, it's funny when you travel to other countries. So my husband, he is Dutch Indonesian. And I'm like, when you go to Indonesia and, you have, I don't know, like 1 million rupiah equal like €1, does it mean that somebody with, I don't know, 100 million rupiah is a millionaire technically? And is it meaningless? And he's never lived in Indonesia, but he's like, I guess so, but because it's worth so little and does so little for you, actually, they just want the euros or the dollars. That's what they want. And now moving more towards Bitcoin, because I think people are really waking up to people. So yeah, in the Netherlands, they obviously know their history of colonization in Indonesia, but now people in Indonesia are like, wait a minute, this has these after effects, forever, and it's just not getting better.
Right.
It's really telling. And I wonder if that is the case in all these places where you go, that it's so hard to change over currency because they have all these 000s tacked on. I remember when I went to Zimbabwe, I had I think a $10 billion bill, that they sell in the street for $1. And I just thought at the time, I was like, oh, it's funny. And I'm like, oh, it's not funny. Actually, it's terrible.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think, and what you said is, I think, testament to this. It seems to me that I think maybe people outside of the US more intuitively grasp the implications of Bitcoin, whereas I think in some ways, I think the US might be, a lot of people in the US think of Bitcoin in investment terms, right? But they don't think of it as much in the sort of base layer money terms that you're describing, that I think a lot of people globally think of it. And I think it's obviously because of the US's, privilege, the exorbitant privilege, as the French referred to it, of us being kind of the reserve currency and not really dealing with, an incredible amount of inflation, at least comparatively speaking to these other countries, being under a relatively stable currency. Obviously that's getting a little bit of a fraught thing to say these days, but so in some ways, I wonder if that narrative is going to be, if the US will almost be the last place, or one of the last places where that narrative kind of really hits and is intuitively graspable, something that you just kind of internalize easily because it makes sense based on your lived experience, which I think globally it does. But in the US, it's just not people's experience, at least right now. And I think, the obsession with being a millionaire that's in the personal finance space these days, as if, all you got to do is just be a millionaire without actually questioning what does it actually mean to be a millionaire today versus what it meant, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago. What's it going to mean 20 years from now to have $1 million? And it's once you start reflecting deeply on that, I mean, that's kind of, you start tumbling down.
No, you fuck yourself up. Like you really, it's part of that, that rabbit hole when you also just like, you start to just ask, like, you start to question everything because you really are on this journey to like finding yourself and, what you really care about. And that was another moment for me with looking at my investments and looking at the stock market as it stood. And I'm like, okay, there's just so much writing off of Bitcoin from everyone, right? Whether it's like a Vanguard or whatever, years ago, or people individually, like a financial advisor. And then, just in the past, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, you see kind of trying to be sold like, well, we are in, like a fund that does like ESG. And they try to sell you on all these ways that like ESG is great. And I'm like, well, when I was in corporate, like ESG meant that we had like recycling bins and like, it didn't mean all that much. It didn't do, and when you peel the layers back, I'm like, it's extra fees. It is arbitrary sort of marks that are put in place that I really do think there probably is good intent behind it. Probably not from like a Larry Fink, but I think the person that they like are like, hey, let's come up with this program and try to like sell it to people. And I'm like, but they're selling you a bridge. Like it's not really that. It's just that's why I love that article, that the Alan Farrington one, where it's like, yeah, these slogans and the alphabet soup, it's not going to save you from what's coming, which is just like, yeah, we're on this house of cards.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that is definitely a brilliant article that hopefully a lot of people check out and read. I think a lot of it is definitely kind of, I hesitate to use the word distraction because I obviously think it's important that, I think it's important that we deal with climate issues. I happen to think that Bitcoin is one of the best ways that we can confront the climate crisis. But I think you have things like this, the kind of the concept of ESG, which is more, I think, Farrington's kind of arguing it's more almost like an Orwellian slogan that sort of is completely emptied of meaning and is just, sort of meant as a more of a manipulative thing. I think is used to kind of distract people from, I think, what would be better solutions, more effective solutions, more innovative solutions, frankly, and solutions that are open to that more people can kind of share in the prosperity of those solutions. And I think sometimes we, with kind of this rosy view, look at the personal finance world as if we can beat the game. I think a lot of the index fund stuff is, we beat all the active managers and we get 10% a year. And it's like, do you really think that you're getting one over on Larry Fink? Like, do you think Larry Fink is sweating
the bounds that he'll go to crush the S&P at some point if he has to, but it benefits him right now.
Yeah. And I think what's people don't realize is that really wealthy people are not like wealthy because they're like, giving their money to their Merrill Lynch advisor at the Bank of America down the street and expecting him to beat the index. They are investing in things that you and me and like normal people like don't have access to because these are all accredited investors. So they're investing in various private equity things. They're investing in all the venture capital stuff. They're the people who get the seed rounds of, the Ubers and the Facebooks and the Coinbases. And it's like, they're not sweating you like with the index funds. And I think even the inventor of the index fund himself, Jack Bogle, basically said, if everybody indexes, there's no price signal. It's a catastrophe at that point. There are his words were, there are no markets at that point. And I think that's what Alan was talking about in his article, is he was saying, if you have half of all investment money going into these passive index funds, it's all you're doing is it's price insensitive investing. The money goes to the biggest companies in the index, regardless of how they're doing, which just makes them bigger, centralizes things more. And it's just price blind investing. It's not good for markets, but it's kind of this gift that the retail crowd that we all think that we're being given, like this secret path to wealth that, that it's some kind of revolutionary act. And it's like, no, it's just really, it's the best option for your average person like looking to sort of survive in this hyper financialized world and sort of preserve some purchasing power. But it's the least bad option in a bad system that is not designed, for retail folks. So, I'm not anti index fund, but like if you're actually interested in doing something transformative and building a new financial system that is not this one, you should be coming over to Bitcoin with us. And sort of, because that's what we're all trying to do, is advance a new system that's open to everybody, that doesn't have these sort of walled gardens of investment opportunities where the wealthiest individuals have the access to the best investment opportunities. I mean, Bitcoin's been the best investment opportunity for the last 12 years since it's existed, and it's been open to everybody. And my wife and I both, my wife still does, and I used to work in these circles with these accredited investors, and this is something we're very familiar with, and it's why we're both very into Bitcoin, because it opens everything up.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's it also, in the past few months, once inflation, well, I mean, for me, I in June 2020, by the time things were opening up, I'm like, oh, everything is more expensive than it was. And it wasn't just like sticker shock. It was just, okay, it's more expensive. Fine. I wanted to get out of the house. I wanted to go do whatever. Then in 2021, then you're really noticing that things are up 15, 20%, like going out to dinner, going shopping, getting an Uber, things like that. And I'm like, yeah, is kind of stuffing people to just put your money there. Is that the same thing that we've done with like poor and working poor people, with like, just pay off your debt, just make more? I'm like, and now we're doing that with like the middle class, and you're just seeing that, just that crowd of people that you're just kind of, take this and be happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, it's only a matter of time until people are like, yeah, this isn't working for me. I watched a clip where Alex Gladstein talks about, he's talking about reasons for Bitcoin, and he's like, the average American investor has in their, retirement fund, big pharma, weapons, like all kinds of fossil fuel, like this is what are in these holdings. And you gotta just be honest about that. Like, this is not accusatory. This is like all of us at some point, and it is.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And there's, and I was just talking to my wife about this. There's this kind of bizarre political posturing in the personal finance community, and I promise I'm not just trying to like badmouth the personal finance community. I have a lot of friends there, but there's a cognitive dissonance where a lot of people in that space will kind of badmouth capitalism, and they'll sort of talk about how corporate everything is the worst. And I always want to be like, it's very odd for somebody whose stated aim, and if you were sort of in the FIRE movement and the personal finance index fund kind of crowd, your stated aim is to live off of your accrued capital, off of like interest and rents basically from your accrued capital for the rest of your life, not from your labor, but from your capital. That is the definition of capitalism. That's what you're telling everybody else to do, and then you're kind of like, oh, this is what I want to do, but capitalism sucks. And which is also, I mean, there are some bad things. I mean, certain iterations of capitalism are brutal, and we should be mindful of that. But I always find that bizarre. And then there's the, at the same time, it's like your entire net worth is tied to these corporations that you bemoan, nonstop. And it's just weird. It's a very, but I think that's just kind of I think the fiat world is so, corrupted, and everything is kind of turned upside down. You end up being sort of forced to take these positions where you're like, oh, I hate X, Y, and Z, but my entire net worth, my entire future depends on the success of those things. And like you said, and like, quoting Alex Gladstein there, I mean, there are all kinds of, the S&P is filled with companies doing a bunch of stuff that, people probably wouldn't like if they knew what it was. But they also probably, the number in their portfolio probably wouldn't like if those companies were forced to correct those things, because that number would go down, probably, which is not to sort of defend you know, free markets to such an extent that we just like destroy the world at, you know, in its name. But it's just to suggest some of the cognitive dissonance that exists, and that doesn't exist in Bitcoin, which is, you know, kind of why I try to sort of urge people, you know, if you're frustrated with how this current system works, don't sort of tie your whole life to the perpetuation of this system. Like, there is another system being built right next to it. Like, we're all trying to opt into that system, and there are all these wonderful people working to sort of educate people and bring people aboard, and you know, you should take a look over here. Because, you know, if like I said, if you're trying to find something new, something revolutionary, that's the place. Like, it's not going to happen in your Vanguard index fund, I assure you.
Yeah, it can't. It's like, it's not possible.
Yeah.
Like, it's not possible at this point.
Not at all.
But you mentioned something interesting too around like this idea of capitalism, and you wrote that article about like late stage fiat versus capitalism. Also, just to throw in that I'm like, this is what we're in right now. This is cronyism. This is like the need for social distancing between the state and the private sector. That's cronyism. The like kickbacks, the, you know, just it's creditism, it's cronyism. I don't know. I can't define fascism enough, and it's too much of like a live wire. If you like, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm like, yeah, this is what it looks like. This is why everyone's pissed off, except for like a few, you know, chosen ones who are in the right place at the right time. But I think, yeah, I think this is interesting to go into the like late stage fiat versus capitalism.
Yeah, I think something you said earlier struck me, and it's a good opportunity to kind of bring it back up. But you were describing your own journey as you were sort of getting into Bitcoin, and you said you felt a kind of nihilism, kind of looking around. And I think a lot of people feel that, and I felt that. And I think some of the things that people feel kind of nihilistic about and hopeless about is people look at this wealth inequality, and people look at, they get kind of outraged, not unjustifiably, at sort of some of the just grotesque wealth that accrues to asset holders, particularly during COVID, when, you know, the market started to kind of perk back up, and then it sort of went absolutely parabolic, which should have been really, alarm bells should have been going off for everybody at that point. And I remember you'd see the headlines all the time of, oh, you know, the billionaires have gotten this much richer, you know, during COVID, and with the implication being they're, you know, exploiting us even more now. And what I was trying to do in the article is just, because people lump all these things into this broad catch-all term of, you know, this is late stage capitalism.
Yeah.
And, you know, which is just a term that just means everything sucks, basically.
Yeah, I'm like, I always want to ask, like, what's
it just means it's, I find that
when were we in it? Were we having fun? Like, I don't even know.
Right, because it's like you know, people like Marxists have been calling things late stage capitalism for the last 100 years. You know, World War I was the end of capitalism, allegedly, you know, according to some, you know, Marxist theorists at the time. So it's kind of just, now I think people just use it as this kind of fun thing that millennials say sometimes, just, you know, to just mean, and I, being a, you know, proud millennial, but some people just say it to mean this sucks and the billionaires are taking everything.
Yeah.
But what I was trying to do with the article is just point out that it's not actually, that some of the stuff that we're complaining about has to do directly with just the corruption of the money itself, and the just historic expansion of the money supply. I mean, Elon Musk got super rich during COVID because we pumped so much liquidity into the economy, and, you know, because of things like the Cantillon effect, that liquidity is going to first kind of go to the most creditworthy institutions and individuals, who are going to then, you know, pump it back into assets, and a lot of it's going to pool in assets. Lynn Alden is great in her discussions of this. And so it's going to juice the prices of those assets. I mean, interest rates are zero, or were zero at the time, and were zero for a long time. So that money coming in, those wealthy people kind of getting the first access to all that sort of cheap money. And it's all being poured back into assets, and those prices as are going nuts. So it's not that Elon sold, exponentially more vehicles in, late summer 2020. It's just the stock price of Tesla went parabolic because of all of this liquidity that was pumped in,
Yep.
which was a decision by the government and the Fed to do that. That wasn't just Elon didn't show up to the Tesla, warehouse and say, "Hey guys, let's crank the exploitation up a notch. I got to get richer. So let's, that's not what happened." And I think it's just a useful illustration. I think, and that's what I was trying to do in the article, was just illustrate that some of these problems that people are attributing to capitalism itself are more accurately attributable to fiat currency, which has only been with us since, truly fiat currency, since 1971. And so maybe if we have that realization, we can address that first and maybe fix that. And then from there, maybe we can move on to, surely there are still some, I would argue that there are still some parts of capitalism that we want to, be thoughtful about and kind of incentivize in the right directions, with a light enough hand to not be, as super interventionist as we are now.
Yeah.
I know, and not all Bitcoiners agree on that statement, and that's totally fine. And we can have thoughtful disagreements there. But I just was getting very weary of some of the, people who, just kind of say, "Oh, this sucks. It's late stage capitalism, and we're never gonna make it out of this." And it is kind of like this nihilistic approach. And but like you said, you kind of find Bitcoin and you realize, oh, I actually know, I kind of can point to the problem now, which gives me hope. If you can see the problem, then you can go about addressing it, which I think is a sort of point of optimism, or something to be optimistic about. So that's what I was trying to highlight with that piece. I definitely got some pushback kind of from both sides, but which I of course welcome, which I think is good and productive. But yeah, I was just trying to get people to be more specific about, here's the thing that's actually wrong. It's not totally what you think it is. In the hopes that, maybe we could just get more people thinking about how we solve that problem.
Yeah, no, I think it's we're in this era of people see things online, myself included, this sloganeering, or the alphabet soup, that we're like, oh yeah, that's it. We pinpoint it, and then we start using it. But if you're just using it loosely, usually when you do ask people what they mean by, policies or anything that they're going on and on about, they're kind of like, well, things, vibes. I'm like, look, I've also had.
I don't know. It's the billionaires. Yeah.
I'm like, I've also had to. I'm like, oh, I hope no one ever puts me on the spot, because I don't have shit to bring to the table. But outrage. That's when I realized, you sound like an idiot. You're being a useful idiot if you're doing that, and it doesn't serve you or anyone else, the people who you're trying to help.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that. Yeah, I agree, and I think it's. I try to tell people, I totally understand the outrage. I actually share the outrage. I have the outrage too. I think we should all, we're all looking at, the state of things now, and it's not the most inspiring picture right now. I understand very much that people are frustrated and people feel like are living in a very unfair world. And most of my clients now are all very, blue collar working people, and I get it. I understand why people are angry. But I think it's just important to, if we're actually going to use that anger effectively to solve the problems that we want to solve, the first thing we got to do is accurately diagnose the problem. And I think there's a lot of bait and switch stuff kind of coming up from above to sort of misdirect our collective gaze at things that aren't the problem, but are just useful scapegoats for the real problem. And so hopefully we can, Bitcoiners can kind of continue to push people to see and diagnose properly and accurately the plane on which the problem actually exists.
Yeah, and now I have I feel like I've I had this nihilism, and then it kind of went to, being really observant and skeptical. And I'm really happy that happened, because now, I think what's happened in the past few weeks with the Amazon and unions, it's been really amazing. And you can almost see like the media and the government trying to like defang this moment and, you know, make the kid Christian like more palatable to the public. And they're like having him on the news and stuff. And now I'm like, I think he did an amazing thing when he was in there, you know, in the weeds getting this done. And now they're trying to court him. So now I'm like, all right, well, now I'm skeptical about what they're trying to like have him be their media darling and like position him. I'm like, no, stick with it. Like keep like insulting people, like keep ridiculing this system. It's ridiculous. Like keep at it. Don't go to their stupid dinners or whatever, you know, they're inviting you to. So yeah, the power of learning and changing your mind and, you know, being able to look at things with a discerning eye is definitely yeah, cool. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I have two. Well, you told me that you answered one of my questions, whether it was you or your wife, and how you kind of were like, hey, there's this thing. So my last question is, what is your biggest concern about Bitcoin that maybe not enough people are talking about?
First of all, I think this is an amazing question.
I've been loving doing it. I've been getting like really good answers from everyone. So
this is such a good question. Yeah. And I hope you continue to ask it to everybody. Which I will be eagerly listening to see what everybody says. Because I think we should be doing this exercise all the time, asking this question. We should constantly examining what could go wrong. And so for me, I think the biggest, I would say the biggest concern I have about Bitcoin that I don't think people talk enough about is I think Bitcoiners sometimes have this view that hyper Bitcoinization or, moving to a Bitcoin standard world is inevitable. And I think, and this is another, I think it's a risk to view anything as inevitable, particularly in the same, if Bitcoiners are viewing hyper Bitcoinization in the same way that, for example, the Marxists in the early 20th century were viewing, the progression of history as inevitable, that it was inevitable that, that feudalism would turn into capitalism, capitalism would fail and it would yield socialism, and then socialism would evolve into communism. Like that's sort of the way that, textbook Marxism is this theory of history that it's inevitable, that it's inevitable that these things develop in this way. And things don't always develop in that way. As Marxists have been largely disappointed, I think, for the last 100 years, because things have not developed inevitably the way that they thought. And when they have sort of the instances of socialism that we have seen have been harmful, to put it incredibly lightly and charitably, because I would say they've gone kind of like horrifically bad. I just think Bitcoiners need to constantly kind of have be reflective and be thinking about how things are evolving, because if history has taught us anything, it's that nothing is inevitable, and you just can't take it for granted that it's inevitable, and that game theory is going to play out in the nation states, and every nation is going to be forced to adopt it, and every because I'm sure you hear that all the time. Everybody in the space hears that all the time, and it's not that I don't think that I think there's distinct and strong, reasonably strong probability that we do sort of move to a world where it makes a lot of strategic sense for nations to adopt Bitcoin in one manner or another, which I do think once that happens, there's a reasonably strong probability that other nations are going to look at it and say, oh, okay. And I do think there's some game theory that could play out there. But that being said, I don't think I would ever say that it's inevitable. And I think it's dangerous to set up a kind of like theory of history in that way, that it's just going to evolve in that direction, because I think it leads to complacency, and I think it makes it almost like a hyper ideological kind of almost like religious thing, where you're just like, oh well, it's like Christians talking about the second coming, or Marxists talking about when socialism is going to arrive. It's this thing that it becomes like an abstract, like utopian end that you're searching for. And I think, because I also think that Bitcoiners sometimes traffic in some utopianism that is can be useful, because it gives people hope, gives people things to work toward. But I also think it shouldn't be like narcotizing, like it shouldn't make us complacent. And I don't think this kind of utopian stuff historically has turned out well. So I think we should just be more measured, I guess, and be more kind of grounded, understand that this is powerful technology. The implications of this are huge. We are living through, I truly believe we are living through history, that people will look back at this moment, kind of the way they look back at the Industrial Revolution or the Renaissance or something like that, that we're in this transitional phase. But I definitely don't think we should take for granted that it ends any particular way. And I wish more people would think about that and kind of, and not say, oh, well, when hyper Bitcoinization happens, then yada, yada, yada. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I mean,
and it could be as it happens, as we move closer, but
and there are also just quirks of like things happen. I mean, I love history so much. I'm constantly listening to like lectures and nerding out about history. And it's just, there are constantly these moments that are completely unpredictable, that nobody could have predicted, that just disrupt and subvert everything, and completely change the course of nations and of history. And I don't think we should underestimate that.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. And I'm like, also history teaches us that like when your enemy, because I do now look at, I really do look at this like global kind of like giant government. I'm like, it feels like an enemy. Like it just, we're at this point where they're so big, so powerful, that I'm like, yeah, you can't, when they're in a corner, when they're backed into a corner, you don't know what they're going to do. And right now with where they are with money printing, they've been backed into a corner since probably about 2016, 17, when the ratios were already starting to show out of control. So I'm like, like I said on my episode with Ken, I'm like, yeah, I know that the Federal Reserve, it's a boundless evil that's there. And I don't think I think that's the same for all of these centralized organizations. So you don't know.
Yeah, there's an Orwell quote about how, those in power, they never relinquish it easily. It's just not, and so, which I think is, kind of summing up what you said.
Yeah. All right, cool. Logan, where can people follow your work?
Well, I write a newsletter. It comes out, it used to come out every week. Now it's coming out every 2 weeks. It's called Think Bitcoin. It's on Substack, thinkbitcoin.substack.com, I believe. You can find me on Twitter at the Y of Phi. That's the Y like WHY of Phi, FI. I'm on Instagram, same handle. But yeah, DMs are always open. Check out the newsletter. Happy to chat with everybody. And it was a real pleasure having this conversation.
Yes, same. And I will link to everything. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.